Welcome to this meeting in person or by proxy at Newington Green Chapel. When exactly we'll meet again remains to be seen, but we will keep going either in person or online, or a mixture of the two as circumstances create. My name is Laurie Elks. I'm one of the people who organises events for Hackney Society, and I'm delighted to welcome Christian Wolmar for this meeting. I should explain the circumstances I got in touch with him. I read a piece which said that back in the 1980s, Crossrail 2, as we now know it, the Dalston to Chelsea line, had pole position. That was going to go first, and Crossrail 1, the Elizabeth line, which is now being built, was going to come later. But it was a matter of such importance that they passed the papers to Mrs Thatcher, who, possibly unlike the present Prime Minister, tended to read the stuff that was put in front of her. And she said to the civil servant, when she'd seen it, "Hackney? Hackney? Who wants to go to Hackney? You know the kind of people who live in Hackney. They're not Conservative voters." And so it came to pass that the Crossrail line was, Crossrail 2 was pushed back. But the civil servant in question, I believe, leaked this to Christian, and he told the story, and that prompted me to get in touch with him. I think since then, there are probably even fewer Conservative voters in Hackney now than there were then, but everybody seems to want to go to Hackney for one reason or another. And the picture has improved a little bit since then, as Christian will explain. But he's going to put it all in a larger context of the history of London's transport. Those of you who are attending remotely and are YouTube enabled will be able to put questions in the chat, and we'll have a Q&A session with remote and live questions afterwards. Nick, have I missed anything out before I introduce Christian? Thank you. Christian, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much. It's a delight to at least be partially IRL in real life, as we now call it, which just used to be life, but now it's in real life. I'm delighted also to be in such a wonderful setting, and in Hackney. I live in Islington next door, but I have many friends in Hackney. So just a few words about me. I'm a journalist, essentially, and rather proud of that, even though it's a discredited profession, although Pippa Creer of the Daily Mirror has been kind of restoring our reputation recently with all her exclusives about parties and the like. And I worked for the Independent, the Observer, the London Daily News before that, the Ham and High, all sorts of papers and magazines, and then left the Independent some 20 years ago to go freelance, and largely writing about railways and transport history and transport policy. And I've written a series of 20 books, mostly about railway history, and the latest of which is called Cathedrals of Steam, which is about the London railway stations. And I've just completed a history of British rail, and I'm also updated my book on Crossrail, which is going to come out when Crossrail opens. It was originally written for when Crossrail should have opened in 2018. And I rushed it out for then, and it didn't sell many copies because nobody knew what Crossrail was because they hadn't opened it. But really, it will open in, well, I have it on good authority from high sources in City Hall that it will open in March. And I'm pretty sure it will. They are doing what's called testing operations, which means basically that they're getting lots of people into the line and checking out whether they all evacuate and whether it's all safe and whatever. And that is the last stage before a line is open. So they're pretty confident it's going to open in March, if not April. but it's certainly, we're going to see it next year. And this is not about Crossrail, although I do talk a bit about Crossrail. Once it opens, go on it straight away. It's just amazing. But I'll talk a little bit about that later. And my next book, which I'll just bore you with because I always want to seek out anybody who knows about this story. My next book is, which I've just been commissioned to write, is the story of the railways and the Normandy invasion. And it's a sort of untold story that everybody who writes about D-Day and the subsequent stuff talks about tanks and talks about lorries and talks about guns and talks about armies. And they've completely forgotten that actually the railways carried the bulk of the equipment, and the railways had to be rebuilt essentially from scratch because between the Allies and the Resistance, they had kind of wiped out the railways. And nobody's actually told this story, so it's all going to be dug up from various archives and stuff. But that is my next book, and it's going to take me the next year of my life, but I'm very excited about it. In fact, I'm more excited about that book than any book I've written so far. This lecture is a bit of a hybrid of about 3 different bits of my book. I'm no expert on Hackney particularly, but I have written lots of books about London and its history, and I've sort of tried to do a little mishmash of my books and the story. I'm going to basically, I sort of call it Hackney Missing Out, and basically I'm going to sort of outline the way that Hackney missed out on everything, all modes of transport basically, and the kind of first big innovation in transport in London, apart from the bridges, was the new road, which is now called the Euston Road or the Marylebone Road or whatever, and it was really a bypass round the city. But again, it didn't sort of go to Hackney. It kind of went round. You can see Hackney in the corner there, number 9. But it sort of, its purpose was really to divert the traffic away from the centre of London and kind of keep it slightly kind of with, oh, no, why does that happen? Right, sorry, I suspect we're going to have a struggle with this today. And so the next innovation was actually, I've skipped one there, I think. Have I skipped one? Sorry. Skipped one? No, sorry. Yes, it's, no, I am pushing that, yeah, I am, but it's not really, it's behaving with a delay. I was told to, maybe it might be easier to do next slide rather than me trying to control this thing because it ain't working, really. It's working very haphazardly. It's working now. Maybe it's working better now. Okay, so this is London, kind of, in the middle of the 19th century. Really crowded. They say that traffic moved in London at 12 miles an hour in the Victorian times, and it moved now at 12 miles an hour. It's kind of, or 11 miles an hour. It's kind of never moved any faster than that. And I'm sure this is a bit of artistic license, but I'm sure it's pretty chaotic. And next slide, please, because it's not working. And so one of the great innovators, I'm going to give up on this, and you're going to do it. One of the great innovators was Charles Pearson, who actually was a city solicitor, one of the rare examples of solicitors and lawyers doing anything useful. And he devised the idea, sorry if there's any lawyers amongst you. He devised the idea of the London Underground. He managed to put together a financial package which involved the City of London. It involved the various railway companies to get the London Underground, which was called the Metropolitan Railway, of course, the first line. Next slide, please. Sorry, I should have had this slide before. Just slightly prior to that, there were buses. And there were only buses. And the first bus was actually, just as the first underground did, also ran between Paddington and the city. and the first underground line, which you'll see a picture of in a second, also ran between West London and the centre. And I think the reason for that is because that corridor is very constrained by the river. The river goes up and down like that. So east-west routes are very constrained. There's very few east-west routes. Whereas the reason why Hackney missed out on all this was because it's just part of the north-south, and there were lots of possible routes north-south, and most of those were to the west of Hackney. Next slide, please. And so the first underground, missing G there, Paddington to Farringdon was 1863. The omnibuses were about 1830. And were quite expensive. They cost £1 to get on an omnibus. And actually the London Underground was about twopence or threepence to go on that in the early days. And it was built by cut and cover. In other words, you dig a great big hole, you put the underground system in and you cover it up. And this is King's Cross. It's still like that. You can see the curve of the underground that is still there. Those lines are still there, and it was a major innovation. It was so revolutionary. You can't really kind of overestimate the extent to which this was a revolutionary idea of putting a railway, which was all smoke, right? It was all steam driven, putting a railway underneath the ground. Next slide, please. And it was built with largely not enormous amounts of trouble. This was one of the rare bits of trouble, which was down towards Farringdon, where they had a collapse. And in those days, they had a collapse. The river flooded. They sorted it out in 3 and 4 days, and then kind of started building again. They built this first line, which was 4 and a bit miles long between Paddington and Farringdon. They built it in 3 and a bit years, and then they were a bit late. I mean, it's quite astonishing, the speed, when you think, okay, Crossrail is a slightly more complicated concept, but how long it's taken Crossrail, which started being built in 2010. So, I mean, it just, I've written about half a dozen books about the Victorians, and I just get more excited about them all the time, about how their ingenuity with very little equipment and very large numbers of people to manage and private capital, people's money being put at risk. They managed to kind of achieve so much. The next slide, please. And there it is. You might wonder why it has 3 rails. If some people very clever, you actually might guess, but actually it was because the Great Western, which had a different gauge, a 7-foot gauge instead of a 4-foot 8.5 gauge, also used the underground. In the early days of the underground, you have to think of it as not really a discrete system of its own. It was really a connection between various stations like Paddington, King's Cross, eventually Liverpool Street, and the like, bringing trains into the system and taking them out again. So you could do all sorts of kind of bizarre journeys, like Southend to Reading or something. You could take a single train that did that because it went through the underground as the middle bit. And a bit what Crossrail is going to do, and certainly what Thameslink does already, connecting north and south, east and west, kind of through the underground. It doesn't actually look like this. The tunnel is rather generous in size there. There were never open wagons carrying people. It's a little bit kind of artistic license, but nevertheless, it shows the tunnels that are still like that today. Next slide, please. And that's the opening at Farringdon, where unfortunately Charles Pearson had died, and the Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington, refused to go because he didn't like being underground. But apart from that, it was a huge success. I hope they have something like that for Crossrail, because they bloody well ought to invite me, but I'm not sure they will. If you just think about it, it was just a momentous moment. London then was, the biggest city in the world. It was the centre of what was becoming an empire. It already had kind of bits like India already, and it was kind of expanding. So it was no surprise that the innovation of the underground system came in London. Next one, please. And then, then we get the ridiculous state in London of how things are built not by cooperation, by competition. So we have this guy, James Forbes, and we have his rival, Edward Watkin, and they both ran respectively different railway companies. One ran the London, Chatham and Dover, which was Watkins, and Forbes ran the South Eastern Railway. And if you wonder why Kent has such a bad railway system, and places like Canterbury and Tunbridge have 2 stations, it's because they were built by rival companies that didn't cooperate. And guess what they did? They had 2 rival companies building the Circle Line, right? So instead of just somebody building the Circle Line, these 2 were building round different ways, right, almost to meet in the middle. So one was going west from Paddington and heading towards South Ken and Westminster, whatever. And the other one was going the other way and building the bits east in East London. And eventually, when the Circle Line opened in 1884, one of them, and I'll never remember which, ran the clockwise one, and the other one ran the anti-clockwise ones. And if you made the mistake of going to the wrong company and buying the wrong ticket, which, you'd have to go 18 stations round instead of 3 because that was the one you had paid for. I mean, just insane. Next slide, please. So that was the absolute core bit. And Forbes built up the District Railway, which, if you think of the District Line today, Wimbledon, Richmond, Putney and all that, but again, no Hackney there, nothing much in the east at all. Apart from the line that went out eventually, which was built by the District Line to Upminster, Barking and Upminster, but that's south of here. And Hackney kind of again missed out. Next one, please. And so that's Edward Watkin, who built the Metropolitan Railway. Again, spreading out, slightly different strategy, spreading out further. That's why the Metropolitan line today has stations as far out as Chesham and Amersham and Aylesbury, and not many stops in between, whereas the District Line was lots of places in between, like South Kensington, Gloucester Road and Hammersmith and the like. So it was a kind of contrasting kind of situation. But again, that was sort of northwest London. The District Line was West London and East London. No Hackney. Next slide, please. So that's what the railways, the London Underground system. The map, of course, was devised much later, but there's a great book about the growing maps of the London Underground, and which has all these maps in it. And that actually shows the first actual tube line, which went from Stockwell through to King William Street, just near the bank. It eventually went to the bank. And that was another innovation, right? All the other lines were built by cut and cover. The tube lines, and that's why they're called the tube, they're built by a different method. You never get to the surface. You dig out with a tunnel and a tunneling machine. Next slide, please. And you just dig it out. So steam engines were not feasible for that. So just at the right time, they were going to 1890 of the City in South London, which ran from Stockwell, and they were going to run it with cables and a static engine at the end. But that's 4 miles of cable. It would have been pretty difficult. And just in time, next slide, please. They found electricity, that they could do it via electricity. And they had these little kind of engines at the beginning that ran up to King William Street. And the funny story about that is that King William was slightly up an incline, and the electricity all came from Stockwell. So the electricity tended to be a bit weak at the kind of northern end of it. And sometimes they wouldn't quite get up the hill and they'd roll back and they'd have to kind of start again. Can you imagine doing that today? They were called the sardine tins, the carriages, because they were pretty. They had no windows because they thought there's nothing to see. Let's not have windows. They didn't realise that actually windows are quite important psychologically. Next one, please. That was the first terminus, which was only a terminus for 10 years, because they then expanded it to Bank. So the Corporation of London got it, but it didn't go up to Hackney. Next slide, please. And then the best of the next one, please. The best of the early tube lines was undoubtedly the Central Line, which was both the most prosperous, the most efficient. It took over a huge kind of swathe of omnibus services, again, on an east-west axis. Again, because that east-west axis is the one that kind of always got congested because there's so kind of few routes. So all these innovations were on the east-west axis without ever going slightly north up to Hackney. And you can see that everybody used the tube. This is aimed not just at the people paying their tuppence, the workers, but also pretty posh people used the underground system. It was and it was ever thus. Very different than in Paris, actually, where actually more affluent people don't tend to use the metro in Paris, whereas in London it's not unusual to see people in sort of dinner jackets on the tube. Next one, please. And so that's what the system was then expanded. There was 3 lines built very quickly: the Piccadilly, the Hampstead line, and the Bakerloo. We pretty much have the map by 1910 of the system today, apart from expansions outwards and the Jubilee and the Victoria and the Jubilee line. And again, no Hackney. Nothing through to Hackney. Kind of, there really is a kind of blank bit there, isn't there? Hackney was, as you'll see in a minute, getting some trains, but they were not getting the underground lines. Next slide, please. So their underground expanded outwards. So this is Hendon, right? This was the golf club that was taken over by lots of houses. And next slide, please. And by Hendon Central Station, 1923. That expanded later on to Colindale. We get line the Piccadilly expanding out to Cockfosters. We get the Central expanding out both eastwards and westwards, and so on, but still no Hackney. Next slide, please. And so, we get the lovely kind of architecture in Cockfosters, quite modernist stuff for 1933. And that's really quite far out, much further out than Hackney. But yet, somehow it still gets omitted. We have a huge kind of terminus at Finsbury Park, which again gets expanded northwards. Lots of trams. London has something like 80 tram routes by this time. Can you imagine what London would be like if we'd retained our tram routes? It just makes me weep. It really does. If you look at a map of the tram routes, it's just astonishing. There were trams absolutely everywhere. I mean, there were trams round Newington Green. Next slide, please. So then we had a big gap between any new lines being built until the Victoria line was built in 1969. The Queen just hopped on it, as she did, and opened it, and that was it was the first line since 1907. And so, in a way, by 1907, we had almost too many kind of lines built thanks to lots of entrepreneurial kind of skills. Victoria Line was only built actually because there was an unemployment crisis in the mid-60s, and they thought, we need some kind of Keynesian type schemes. Amazing, and that was the only reason they built it. And now it's pretty much the most intensively used line. Next slide, please. And there we get the Jubilee, built in 2 chunks, with a bit that was kind of left off that used to go to Charing Cross that doesn't go anymore. So there's a kind of dead tunnel there, and some wonderful architecture. And actually, the Jubilee Line extension was fabulous in terms of, it was certainly a great improvement. But the trouble with the tube is the size. It's 11.5 feet in diameter, and it just kind of isn't big enough. And all the lines, even the Victoria Line, was still built in that size. Jubilee Line was really an extension of the Bakerloo, so they had to build it that size. Next slide, please. And so now we get the system as it was today. You can see there was a little bit of Hackney there with the North London line shown, but still nothing approaching a decent transport service. So let's look. Next slide, please. Let's look at that North London Railway, which was a curious railway. It's a complicated railway, even though I've written much about it and often kind of refer to it in my various books. I'm still slightly confused about kind of exactly where it went at various times. But it started off, next one please, it started off as a line that was going to run from the London docks to Birmingham, right? So it was not aimed at the good people of Hackney even then. It was really aimed as a kind of a freight railway. But it got into financial trouble, as many of these lines did. And so they ended up kind of focusing more on local people. Next slide, please. And it went to Camden, where it got stuck for quite a long time and ran through to the docks from Camden. So avoiding the city centre. So it was not that fantastically useful for people in Hackney, but it did have 2 or 3 stops in the borough. Next slide, please. And then in the 1860s, they decided to build it into central London, and so that it had a spur down to central London. And to Broad Street, which at one point was the 3rd busiest station in London. And it's the only one of the dozen stations that I cover in my Cathedrals of Steam book that actually was demolished, as you'll see in a moment. But you can see that's quite a substantial kind of station. It served quite a lot of different destinations, not just the obvious ones of the North London line, but running trains out to Southend and even further south than that, trains south of the river via Fenchurch Street and stuff. So it was that was a great addition, and obviously there were stops at places like Haggerston and Homerton and the like, which were useful for the good people of Hackney. So they did at last get something of a service into central London. Next slide, please. And then the Great Eastern Railway expanded, so you can see the North London line, kind of the bits of that there, and that's the North London line. And then the Great Eastern expanded greatly out to Enfield and Edmonton and Tottenham and various places like that. And what's interesting about that is that Liverpool Street, mostly, and to some extent Broad Street, developed the most intensive kind of suburban service. And to a great extent created the sort of London that we have today in the East, which was smaller houses that workmen could afford, because there were workmen's trains in the morning running into Liverpool Street, lots and lots of them in all these stops. And so therefore the housing that developed was actually much smaller housing than the housing that developed in a lot of the West, where there are fewer stations aimed at middle classes and didn't have the kind of cheap train services that we get in the East and Northeast. And Hackney's a bit between that. I mean, they have some fairly posh houses in Hackney, intermixed with kind of smaller houses. But certainly further out, the houses all got smaller and low-rise and terraced housing that was serving the working classes mostly, maybe kind of lower paid clerks. The next one, please. And so you see from this map, which is just turn of the century, that again, kind of, there's not much help for Hackney, and that all the tube services and stuff are concentrated elsewhere, and pretty much serve most other places other than Hackney. Next slide, please. And Broad Street, as I said, was actually, Hackney's link into central London was actually demolished. Partly, British Rail did that old trick, really, of running down the services so much. You can see from this map when the services were still running. It's pretty kind of sad kind of look about it. And it really did this thing of kind of running down the services, cutting off most of the trains, and then saying, well, nobody's using this, so we might as well demolish it. But also it was part of the Liverpool Street redevelopment, which actually, I have to praise. It was a good development and has seen the test of time and did result in a much better station. Next one, please. So that's the North London line. It struggled. The North London Railway, when it was private, and the North London line, which was taken over by the London Midland region of British Rail, which never really paid much attention to it, was a pretty poor service, and indeed was threatened by beaching. They were going to close it. And I do remember one of the first political things I did was get involved in the campaign to keep it open, even though I hardly ever used it. And nobody else much used it either. There were, next slide please, there were basically 2 trains an hour, and very, very, very sparse usage of it. Hackney also got the East London line, which was also a pretty useless line, actually. It eventually became part of. It never really kind of was heavily used, and not surprisingly, because it went from nowhere very much to nowhere very much without kind of going into the centre properly. Through the Rotherhithe Tunnel, which was the first tunnel built under London by Brunel, the father, Mark Brunel, and eventually was taken over by London Transport and became part of the underground network. But I do remember it as a kid. It was just a line that you never used. You just it never. As a kid, I used to just travel around the underground for free, kind of most of the day, some of the time, just having fun. But I barely ever bothered to go on the East London line because I didn't really know particularly where it was going to go to. Next slide, please. And the North London line suffered greatly under privatisation when it was run by Silverlink. Maybe you might remember the Silverlink. It was a terrible service. It had these terrible old trains. In fact, these were slightly more modern ones. It had 101s, which were like really kind of the first diesel trains almost to be built, and it had a half-hour service. The Hampstead Tunnel was often closed. Just nobody bothered with it at all, and it's such a good example of how, if you invest in something, it then kind of gets used and becomes useful. Next slide, please. And so, contrast that with today, with all the investment that's taken place, the reopening of chunks of the North London line to create the links, of the investment, and that was thanks to the creation of the Greater London Assembly and the the mayor's office and TfL. Remember, between 1987 and the year 2000, London had no overall kind of administration, thanks to Mrs Thatcher. And so it was kind of, completely neglected. But fortunately, once you got the TfL created, they looked at things like this of creating reviving, one key point was reviving this, which is not shown on this, but reviving the Snow Hill Tunnel so that Thameslink services were started again. That was done by Ken Livingstone, actually, and that was reopened, and that was a ridiculous closure, and that resulted in north and south kind of being connected. And then TfL did all this work on creating the overground and taking over some of these are kind of old services that belong to BR, but most it's kind of actually created chunks of new line to link services and at last provide Hackney with a decent rail service, if not a tube service, but it's a London Overground is a great success. Next slide, please. And then we get something where, fortunately, Hackney missed out on, luckily, which was the motorway boxes, which were this is a map from just after the war, and the idea that we would have a chunk of dual carriageways, motorways, kind of operating around London. Next slide, please. And there were going to be 3 of these. There's going to be one kind of essentially around Zone 1 and 2. There'll be one around the North and South Circulars, and there'll be one further out, which actually has been built as the M25. But the second one, North and South Circulars, has never really been completed. And very fortunately, the inner ring, the inner motorway box has never been constructed. Next slide, please. And it was kind of proposed, and you can see where it would have gone. And a little chunk of it, M11, was built, and that blue chunk in the West London, which was a spur into central London, was actually built and causing great damages. Next slide, please. As you can see from this, I mean, can you imagine if this had gone ahead, cutting a swathe through Hackney, Camden, and then down to Shepherd's Bush, and then down through South London, through Chelsea, eventually kind of reaching on the south through Southwark and Blackheath, creating that round London and all the spurs and the kind of additions. Tottenham Court Road was going to be a massive kind of ring road to enable people to travel through. Now, this happened to a lot of towns and cities in Britain, and Birmingham being the most obvious one, but lots of smaller towns, I mean Luton and Burnley and all sorts of places have kind of these road systems that essentially destroyed the town centres. So this would have destroyed Hackney completely, because it would have gone right through the middle of Hackney with spurs and God knows what else to link it. Unfortunately, this was really only the only chunk that really got built was this bit of Westway, and also that very strange bit of 3/4 of a mile of motorway that goes from the White City into Shepherd's Bush, the M41, I think it used to be called. I don't think it's called that anymore. And that was that was the way that London would have gone. And unfortunately, again, that was one of the political campaigns I was involved in at an early stage, was not to build the ringways. And that had Labour and Tory support for about 10 years, between about 1960 and 1973. This was a bipartisan plan to solve London's transport system. Next slide, please. So, what killed it off? Opposition. Eventually, the scale of the destruction. I think that the initial bit they built, Westway, kind of put people off. But, you know, there by the grace of God goes London. It wouldn't be the London that we know if it had happened. Next slide, please. Then we get the bit of good news, but not entirely for Hackney again. Crossrail, another east-west kind of development. You can see the pattern, right? Next slide, please. So Crossrail had lots of different route proposals, and eventually they settled essentially on this one. There was an earlier version of Crossrail, which was thrown out by Parliament in 1995 or 4 or 5, actually when I was working at the Independent, they kind of got to quite far down the development and then rejected it because there was really no money to pay for it. But they safeguarded the route, as they have with Crossrail 2. Which is going through the same process at the moment. So next slide, please. So eventually they built this. Some oddities in that it doesn't cross the Victoria line. Why does it not cross the Victoria line? Because they thought that if they had a station at Oxford Circus, it would be too busy. Which is kind of a bit odd, really, to say, oh, we're not building this because it will be too popular. That's kind of a contradiction. Also, half the trains turn around at Paddington, which is bizarre because you know, it's not what you really want. You don't want to have to kind of turn the trains around, you know, when they could be going off somewhere else. But there's nowhere much apart from the airport and Reading, and you could just run so many trains to Reading. You don't really need kind of 12 trains an hour to go off to Reading and Heathrow. So they turn the trains around there, and they're turning them around automatically. So the driver arrives at the westbound station at Paddington and then walks through the train while pushes a button, and then the train takes itself automatically to Westbourne Grove and then back onto the eastbound platform, so that the driver will then be in place to take the train away. That's caused quite a lot of difficulties, actually. You know, one of the reasons it's three years late is because that was quite a difficult system to ensure that it's safe. And I'm not 100% sure when it opens they'll be doing that. Next slide, please. So it is wonderful. As I said before, there's a lot of this kind of soft white panelling. There's platform doors, which is what you see on the left. The platforms are each 240 or 250 metres long, right? That's more than 10 cricket pitches. The trains are 9 cars, but they can be expanded to 10 or 11. And all the passageways are huge. I mean, this is not a tube system. This is a major railway through the centre of London with 9 stations that they dug out to build it. So, okay, it cost £18.9 billion, but, you know, our great-grandchildren will presumably be using it kind of, you know, and it will survive, and it will be a real railway fit for the 21st century. London will be very proud of this. It will be a big, big boost for London when it's actually open. It will be, you know, looked at across the world as an amazing kind of feat. Next slide, please. So then we have the sad story of Crossrail 2, which goes through Hackney, and that has been actually ditched for the moment. Its design is quite set, although still open for debate. And they haven't gone for a local model. So this is not a local train service, really. It's a regional train service to take people from quite far away into central London, and also to stimulate development, particularly in northeast London. So the idea is that its purpose is to help stimulate kind of rather undeveloped parts of London. But the bill is probably 25 to 30 billion, and with the levelling up agenda, with the Crossrail 1 opening and so on, certainly with this government, we're not going to see work starting on this for quite a long time. Although I suspect that once Crossrail opens, there will be kind of great pressure on the government, and particularly if there's a change of government, to begin to look at this again. But for the moment, it's on ice, and I would say carbon dioxide ice, so cold that it's not kind of going anywhere at the moment. Next one, please. So just to give a little plug, these are the books on which much of what I've talked based. Subterranean Railway is the story of the underground. Next one, please. The Cathedrals of Steam is, as I mentioned, the one on the major railway stations, of which there's 12. You can kind of, your little quiz is to work the 12 out. And next slide, please. And finally, the Crossrail book, which is coming out in March with a different, more positive cover, basically saying this is happening and this is going to be wonderful, but why did it take 3 years? And I do examine that in some detail. So that's my little concocted talk. Sorry, it's kind of been slightly kind of bitty, but as I said, Hackney is not my subject of expertise, but London is. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Excuse me. I forgot to say that as well as being writer, journalist, railway buff, polemicist, Christian is also a keen cyclist, and at my invitation he came with a bag full of books. It's nearly Christmas, and I believe that some of the prices are negotiable to a certain extent, so I'll leave that to him after the session. I also forgot to say at the beginning is that I've been authorised by the Treasurer of the Hackney Society to say that if you choose to order any Hackney Society books through the website before Christmas, our speedy team of cycle couriers will bring them to you without any postage charge. So that is certainly a bargain to bear in mind. When Crossrail is open, I plan with my wife to get on the train at Whitechapel and spend a day at Cookham by the River Thames, visit the Stanley Spencer Art Gallery, and
You'll have to change, I'm afraid. But,
we'll have to change at Maidenhead, yes. Now, I know we have to change at Maidenhead. It won't run directly, but that will be a very nice day out.
It will.
Right. Now, Ray Blackburn has the roving mic, and do you also have some questions?
If there are any questions from online, then they will relay them to Christian.
Right. Are there any questions in the room for Christian, please?
All right.
Thank
lots.
you.
Right.
Let's just test the mic. Is the mic okay? Yeah. Excellent.
Am I allowed to take my mask
Yeah,
off?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It was a fascinating talk. I was intrigued. I think the penultimate slide was the Crossrail 2 map, and I've always been intrigued by, and I'm surprised you didn't comment on this, why the biggest gap on the map between stations proposed is between Dalston and Seven Sisters and Tottenham Hale. So again, Hackney misses out. And there was a construction shaft at Stamford Hill, and yet no station. No, it just seems Hackney always misses out.
Yes, I mean, as I said, the thinking behind that is that they want a regional service that buzzes people in quickly from further out, rather than, I mean, they had two different proposals about that, right? So that's why you might have got some shafts that had not happened, because there was a big debate about whether you have this regional railway, like the RER, or whether you have essentially a tube line that then expands outwards. Now, the thinking of that is that there is a limit to what people will put up with. So that's why the tube ends in certain places that are sort of about, at most, kind of 45 minutes to maybe just under an hour from central London. They'll never be more than that. And so the thinking is that if this line was built further out, you didn't want too many stops to slow the trains down. But so that's the thinking. Now, I'm not giving any opinion on that. I think it might be a mistake, but that's what the planners did.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I actually have two questions. One is, you said that the North London line was held up for a long time at Camden. So it went from Camden to North Woolwich, I suppose. Why Camden? Was that something to do with the Regent's Park Canal?
I think it's because it had to go into a tunnel after that. It only has to go to a tunnel at Hampstead, which was expensive to build. So I think that's why it stopped there. It was always penniless. The North London Railway didn't make much money. And that was the problem. It did go to Kentish Town after that, and then it stopped, and eventually they built that tunnel, which is very expensive underneath Hampstead. So that was the reason.
Question is, last week I took the underground from Kennington to Battersea Power Station, and it seemed to be through an old tunnel. Do you have anything to say on that? No,
it's through a new tunnel. I mean...
is it? Oh.
No, that's an entirely new tunnel. They built a couple of miles of tunnel with one stop in between, isn't there? 9 Elms. No, I haven't been there yet, actually. No, that took nearly 8 or 9 years to build. And again, they could have continued through to Clapham Junction, but they didn't dare continue through to Clapham Junction because they thought too many people would get on at Clapham Junction and crowd out the North London line, and then therefore, the Northern line, and nobody would then kind of be able to get on at Kennington and places further in. And so they haven't joined it to Clapham Junction, which would be the logical thing to do, because Clapham Junction, as you know, has got more platforms than anywhere else and so on. But so, again, it's a very interesting kind of decision, but maybe one day it might get to Clapham Junction if they kind of, if the pattern, we haven't talked about COVID and the way COVID might change our commuting habits, but my view is that it certainly will.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. An observation and a question, if I may. I suppose actually the observation is a question. I'd always understood that, going back to the motorway box, I'd always understood that the Blackwall Tunnel approach and the road running north from that does actually come into Hackney, and the rather sort of truncated junction, which then shoots off out towards the M11, the A11 road. I'd always understood that was part of the motorway box, so that the Hackney was, and it is a road that blights that particular part of East London. I'd always assumed that Hackney did get a bit of motorway box.
I'm slightly unaware that the M11, of course, was a much later.
Yes, but this
the M11 extension was, and there were big battles about that, and I remember covering those when I was on the Independent, so it would have been about 1995, 96, so it was much later. They built that M11 extension, but did that not then build that extra bit?
This is considerably
right.
further west than the M11, so if you drive up from the Blackwall
I know the
Tunnel,
bit you mean, yes.
Yeah, and
Laurie knows the answer, do you,
Laurie
Laurie?
knows the answer. I'd come back. I've got a question
Okay,
as well.
okay, well, ask your question after Laurie gives the answer.
All right.
Okay.
The question is, the Crossrail 2 weaves its way through central London, and I noticed that it goes through Tottenham Court Road, which will be almost as busy as they weren't prepared to let Oxford Circus become if it ever gets there. I'm slightly surprised that there is room for yet another tunnel, because you've got deep sewers, you've got the Central Line, you've got the Victoria Line, you've got Crossrail, you've got an awful lot under there.
There's a lot of tunnels around there.
How on earth do they squeeze it in?
Possibly by going deeper. Crossrail, by the way, for precisely that reason, you'd think that it looks on the map like a straight line, but actually there's bends in Crossrail the whole time. I haven't yet had my cab ride. I've been promised a cab ride, but because of this bloody Omicron, I haven't had the cab ride. But I'm told that Crossrail goes like that, and I suspect that Crossrail 2 would also weave its way up and down. It also goes up and down between 20 and 40 metres and all sorts of things. It also Crossrail 1 had to avoid the bunker underneath what was then the American embassy. One of the people who worked, one of the managers on Crossrail, told me a funny story of how at one point there were concerns about this, and then suddenly he got this phone call. He said, "I'm not going to tell you who I am, but I can tell you that actually your tunnel doesn't get in the way of the embassy, so it's all fine." But he wouldn't say who he was. Laurie, you were going to explain about the M11 and...
Yes, the East Cross route ended at Hackney Wick, but was supposed to join with the North Cross route, the motorway box, which would have run up along Wick Road, Morning Lane, Graham Road, with a massive interchange, the Cecilia Road interchange at Dalston, which would have devastated Dalston, and you would have been able to get to Brent Cross Shopping Centre in 10 minutes. But that was that was what was intended. That the East Cross Road ended where the North Cross Road was intended to begin.
Oh, right. And so they built part of that, right?
Yes, and it would all have been above ground in Hackney. It was the Ministry of Transport people thought that the people of Hackney weren't worth any tunnelling for, and of course that happened in Westway, where the people of North Kensington, who weren't posh at all, had their communities devastated by an elevated motorway. Actually,
to be fair to the people of the Ministry of Transport, they were going to devastate Blackheath and Chelsea as well. So, they were, 20,000 homes was an optimistic number that I put on my slide. Some people think it was rather more than, it would have been more than that. Whatever it was, I do think it's the greatest planning decision ever was to scrap that, and the worst planning decision ever was to scrap the trams. But, sir?
Yes, it might be a figment of my imagination. I'm sure I read it many years ago, and I should have researched a bit more before I came here. But I'm sure I read early workings of a plan to run a tube line basically along the line of the A10 from sort of Shoreditch area up through sort of Haggerston, Dalston, Stoke Newington. I don't think it got much more than just drawings and designs. I'm not sure what level of feasibility it ever got to. But yeah, I'm sure there was some sort of outlying plans there.
That's not one I've come across, actually. There were various plans, and there's actually a book of all London's lost lines that has kind of all this stuff in it. But I don't remember that one. But it doesn't mean that I know everything, so I might be wrong.
I should have done a bit of research.
Yes, I'd be interested.
And just one more thing as well. I share your thoughts on the tram network. I know Ken Livingston worked up plans for a King's Cross to Peckham tram system, and one
along the Uxbridge Road.
Yeah, Shepherd's Bush starting area. And Mr. Johnson's one of his first acts, I think, was to Cannet, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. King's Cross to Peckham, I think it was, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes. The trouble is reinstating tram lines does cause a lot of chaos, and the Uxbridge Road in particular caused Ealing to go Tory at one point. I love tram lines and stuff, and of course now there's lots of bicycle routes as well to add further complexity. Would it be viable? Would it be feasible? I don't think it's ever going to happen now, but yes, it's just a shame they removed the first lot, because that would have been a great base. If you go to somewhere like Zurich, or you see they kept their heritage line and are building extensions all the time, but we lost out on that one. And incidentally, there used to be a trolley bus along the Uxbridge Road, and I know this because it was the 607, and I know this because when they abolished it, my route to school from Kensington High Street to South Ken got the 207A, which was a replacement for the 607, and they kind of expanded it kind of further. So that wasn't until the 1960s. So trolley buses were another great, fantastic loss to London. But there we are.
I think there was a question I spotted in the front row. But
There's a lady here who...
yeah, just before I make that, there's a question sent in online, and I sent it, so I'll just read it out.
Okay.
More of a historical thing. Hackney attracted the better class of person until the 19th century. Did the absence of railways from Hackney prolong this semi-rural splendour, if you like, or was rail transport the selling point from then?
No, you're thinking of the sort of nice villas in the south of the borough and stuff. No, that's probably right, actually. Certainly some areas did not want kind of transport. Most notably, of course, Mayfair, which never got any trams or anything, because they didn't want the hoi polloi kind of polluting the area. So, no, I think places like de Beauvoir Town and stuff were probably very happy not to have kind of nasty train stations kind of clogging up the area. So I think that's a good point.
Thank you. I was thinking of the line that someone just mentioned running a tube line in parallel to the A10. And of course there is I think you said it was the Great Eastern Line originally, that runs from Liverpool Street up to Enfield or Cheshunt.
Yeah.
Now, in all the decades I have lived in Hackney, specifically in Stoke Newington, that line has until recently been the mad woman in the attic, really, of transport. and I do remember, and I'm trying to remember, do you think we were ever in any real risk of losing it? Because I remember it being relaunched with a great fanfare for about 3 months as the Jazz Line. Anybody else remember that?
No. Is it not now taken over by London Overground? That
It is London Overground now.
And they have improved it and putting on...
It's a wonderful service now.
Right. Yeah, which is...
but I also wonder whether there would have been any need for a tube line if one could have simply, as Overground has done, refurbed that line.
No, that's probably all right. Again, that goes to show that if you invest money in a railway line, you get the rewards of lots of people using it, because it was a really kind of forgotten bit of line, wasn't it?
It was awful.
Right.
It wasn't. You didn't feel safe travelling on it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I would like to ask a question about the planning process, in essence, and two questions really. One is to pick up on what you already suggested. What is the current thinking at TfL about future commuting patterns in relation to the way we've all been kicked onto remote working and how that's going to impact the railway network, but also the relationship between TfL or the GLA, Greater London, and the boroughs, and that often creates problems. As a cyclist, that constantly creates problems with boundaries between boroughs and different bits of London governance responsible for different things, and how does that also impact on the railway network as well?
Yes. It's almost impossible sorry, I was taking the mic. It's almost impossible to talk about this at the moment because of, can one call them negotiations between the government and TfL. And I have talked to the senior people in TfL who really fear that this is an attempt to take over many of the powers of TfL, and that it will be central government controlling the planning decisions over things like the Bakerloo line extension, which is also on ice, and Crossrail 2, and even down to things like sustainable travel initiatives, which include cycling, active travel, where the government is now giving money directly to the boroughs to do things, bypassing TfL and bypassing the GLA. So, this is in a real state of flux. And at the moment, my view is that there are fears that because of the reduction in commuting, and I think that will settle down at 20 or 30% less, which means there is a huge funding gap, and already TfL was supposed to pay for itself uniquely of any city in the world. It was supposed to pay for itself without any support from central government. I think we're watching the kind of reversal of the devolution created by the 2000 inauguration of the mayor. So I'm afraid I can't cheer you up on that point. Yes, absolutely, but kind of worse in a way, because there's this financial squeeze.
I've got two more questions, I think,
right.
coming up.
A follow-on from that, in a way, but more simply put, to what extent do we fetter our ancestors, those that go after us, by the pressure to build on, to build over, to reuse? I'm thinking of things like Bishopsgate Goodyard, the Camden disused line that may turn into a garden of some sort. The Eastern Curve, are these problems that we should be fighting more to preserve the overground aspects of, or is it fine? Will we find ways around these?
I can't say I'm expert on that, but I mean, the High Line you're thinking of and stuff like that, I think if they built on the High Line, they could then reverse it, but it's probably not a fantastically useful bit of line. No, I mean, I'm with the Victorians here. The Victorians were incredibly unsentimental about what they built, and if they built a railway station in one place and then thought it's in the wrong place, they demolished it 10 years later and thought, sod this, let's build the better one kind of next door. And I'm largely of that kind of line of thought.
You're mentioning Victorians prompts me to make a comment before my question, which is my greatest expertise is on the River Lee, and the Smeaton built the Lee navigation in 18 months in the 18th century. He presented its plans, it was done on time and on budget, 14 cuts, new locks, new bridges. So I think your enthusiasm to the Georgians probably ought to extend back to the canal age as well.
Okay.
A question which is about COVID, really. There's a great enthusiasm in the planners for building over railway stations, and along the Victoria Line there's been massive development at Walthamstow, at Tottenham Hale, at Seven Sisters, lesser extent at Finsbury Park, and also
at Finsbury Park as well. Massive
Finsbury
stuff.
Park, yes. And also Hackney Wick and Hackney Central and Dalston, which feed into the Victoria Line at Highbury. It struck me pre-COVID that this was unsustainable because the Victoria Line is packed, or was utterly packed at rush hour, and I couldn't see how 8 into 2 could go. Do you agree with me, and do you think that COVID may have saved the planners' embarrassment?
No, I don't actually. I think the Victoria Line could have coped. I mean, they did expand it from 24 to 30 trains an hour, isn't it? No, 36 trains an hour, and I think it could cope. They can't expand it, obviously. I mean, the ideal thing would be to build bigger tunnels, but even though Crossrail is an east-west route, it will maybe relieve some of that to some extent on some journeys. And no, I'm a great fan of what the Americans call transit-oriented development, because the alternative is much worse. Although some of the tower blocks they put up for office purposes, I'm not quite sure how they're going to cope with those. And is the Shard full? Is it actually full? Does anybody know how many people are in the Shard? Is it built partly as just a kind of a capital asset that can be exchanged, but is there really enough revenue from it? I don't know. But basically, I'm not with you there, I'm afraid.
I have a question that's just snuck in from online.
Okay.
It's from Geraint Davis.
Right, Mike. Yeah, he's got the mic on. It's just he's not holding it near enough.
Turn the mic.
Turn the mic.
Apologies. This question is from Geraint Davies from online. How did the southern stretch of the North London line get built via Primrose Hill to Broad Street? Was it at the same time as the rest?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I do know that Primrose Hill was a very odd station and very little used. And then there was a station just west of that, whose name Lismore Circus. That's right. Not many people know this. I just saw that the other day. There was another station before the tunnel at Lismore Circus, and these were stations that a bit like London Fields, that are too far near the centre to be very useful. And that's happened to Primrose Hill. It was too much hassle to get a train into St Pancras, I think it was, to kind of be very useful. So there is it's interesting that, you know, those little suburban stations, rather central stations that are too near the centre are not very useful. So I think that's what happened to Primrose Hill.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the floor?
No?
No?
Okay.
Okay. Well, it remains to wrap up and say thank you and onwards, folks. Thank you very much to Christian Wolmar for his fascinating talk. It was to the company here and to a company out there on the interweb. The last description I read of Mr. Wolmar this afternoon, I think, was best-selling railway author. So that's a neat link to the books that you can buy and increase his selling tonight if you wish.
Thank you very much.
Do have a word with Christian afterwards. And thanks on behalf of the Hackney Society for coming. I'm Ray Blackburn. I'm one of the trustees. I organise the events with Laurie. As he said earlier, this is a hybrid event, both online and physical. We're hoping to move towards the physical in 2022. We'll see what conditions arise and what we can and can't do. But we will have a programme of events in the new year. Please get signed up to the mailing list via our website, hackneysociety.org, if you're not already on the list. If you are, you'll get emails about forthcoming events. It's very nice to see you tonight, and thank you very much for coming. And I wish, on behalf of the Hackney Society, everyone a Merry Christmas and a safe and peaceful New Year. Oh, one more thing. Next event, we have a visit to St John at Hackney, newly refurbished church in the centre of Hackney. St John at Hackney visit on the 15th of January, which will be a Saturday afternoon. Needs to be confirmed, which is why we don't have a booking page yet. But when you're on the mailing list, you will receive an email as soon as that booking page is live. Thank you very much.